Coming up on this episode of Common Denominator.
I think being vulnerable is a strength now. As a leader, when you're more vulnerable, you're giving other people permission to be vulnerable and to open up to you, and you're creating psychological safety.
This is Common Denominator, straight-up conversations with Moshe Popack. Relying on critical thinking and open-spirited debate, we invite you to find common ground on everyday issues and encourage you to be bold, to be optimistic, and to take action. To learn more, head to moshepopack.com, and we'd be so grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to the show. Now, here's your host, Moshe Popack.
Hi, and welcome to Common Denominator. Today, finding common ground on what it takes to be an effective leader. Many of us strive to be leaders, whether it's personally or professionally, but we have different expectations of what leadership means and how to execute it. Is leadership strength? Is it compassion? And how much of it is self-awareness? Turns out, a lot. Joe Cohen is an executive coach, a leadership consultant, and the founder of 40 Pillars, which serves to develop high-quality people and high-performing businesses. He's consulted for Microsoft, Boeing, the Navy SEALs, and many more. He's here to shed light on the most important traits every leader must possess. Hey, Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Moshe. I feel blessed, and I'm very grateful to be here.
So, Joe, as an executive coach, one of the most important concepts that you try to emphasize with your clients is emotional intelligence. Let's try to define what that means.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Moshe. So I define emotional intelligence as your ability to develop your emotions, identify your emotions, and identify the emotions of others.
And for leaders in particular, why is emotional intelligence so important?
Yeah, great question. I think it is the most important thing because when you're leading others, you need to understand how people perceive you, and you need to understand how your emotions are actually impacting the people that follow you.
Let's go a little bit more specific, because I know from a practical perspective, how can we know your own self-aware, right? And then the emotions of other people. What practical steps do you take I guess when you're working with executives, what practical steps do you take to assess that?
There's an assessment that I use, and it takes my clients about 30 minutes to take the assessment. It spits out a report. It's very accurate, and then I go over that report with them. There's 4 major categories of emotional intelligence. One is self-awareness, which is probably the most important. Number 2 is social awareness. 3, relationship management, and self-management. So I give them strategies and tactics on how to develop their EQ in all 4 areas.
So let's talk about each of the 4. So let's talk about self-awareness. What goes into self-awareness, and how do you define someone that is self-aware and someone that's not self-aware?
So one important thing of self-awareness is identifying your emotions. One of the things that I ask my clients to do, and I do myself every morning, is identify what am I feeling? And throughout the day, am I feeling anxious, nervous? Do I have fear? Do I have anger? So name it to tame it. Then you can just breathe into it and sit with the emotion. Don't judge the emotion. Don't suppress it.
So where do you go to practically, let's say this is the executive, to practically make them more self-aware?
I have one of my clients checks in with me. All my clients do. One in particular, he works for a big financial institution. He checks in with me every morning. I'm anxious about this. I have a report, a deadline. I have a quarterly review with my boss. Mm-hmm. So just to identify the emotions is the first step. And I'm there to hold him accountable, to hold space for him. And then I'll respond back with a voice note maybe to dig a little bit deeper.
So I love that. They always say, make one good friend or one mentor I love that you hold them accountable because people need a sounding board or a friend for that conversation. But I'm finding, I just saw a stat that a generation ago with people's, I guess it would apply to their negative, seemingly negative emotions, but to their secrets, they would tell 2 or 3 people a generation ago. Today, people don't trust anybody. But I think we need to go back to that. We need to go back to being more vulnerable and being able to at least do the work to create those vulnerable relationships. So you have that sounding board, right? Or someone that you trust, even if it's a professional.
I think being vulnerable is a strength now. And also, as a leader, when you're more vulnerable, you're giving other people permission to be vulnerable and to open up to you, and you're creating psychological safety. So with my guys, my clients, I'm vulnerable with them, and they're vulnerable back with me, and they feel safe in expressing those emotions. And now it's a habit where they can identify their emotions, and with the tools that I've shared with them, they can go through the emotions and minimize the intensity of the negative emotion.
And then let's go to the second prong, self-management. Tell us a little bit about self-management.
Yeah, self-management is basically using your self-awareness to manage your emotions. So step 1 is self-awareness, is identifying the emotions, right? And being aware of your blind spots. Number 2, self-management is how do you manage them? So one thing that I've shared that I've taken from psychology, CBT psychology, is the ABC thought log. The A stands for activating event, the B stands for belief, and the C stands for emotional consequence. So once you identify the emotion, imagine someone, Joe has a negative interaction with one of his colleagues. So that's the activating event. There's emotional consequences. I'm angry. What's the belief behind that anger? Maybe it's, Sam had intentionally did A, B, C, and D to me, whatever it might be. Okay, let's put that belief on trial, and here are some questions you can use to debunk that belief. One, is there alternative evidence for that belief? Is there evidence? Can we cast doubt on that belief? Is it too extreme? And then identify the cognitive distortion. Am I mind reading? Am I fortune telling? Am I catastrophizing? Then once you do that, you can reduce the intensity. Once Tony Robbins talks about this idea of a belief being the tabletop, and the legs are the reference points. So once you knock out some of those reference points, you minimize the belief, you knock it out. And over time, it becomes a habit.
Right. I think I want to talk about habits, but I also, when I think about fear, the concept of fear, I always say it's false evidence appearing real.
Right.
Right. So when you do that methodology, and I think a lot of reasons, I'm a big believer of starting, of beginning. And I think that the fear that humans have, it's actually false, because how many of the fears statistically, logically, right, kind of like your program, of those fears actually happen? It's like less than 0.5%.
Right.
It's like nothing. And in so many good things, if you started. That's why the start is so important.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So it's naming things and being intelligent with the process. And I want to go to the social awareness, the third prong.
Sure.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, social awareness is your ability to identify what the other person is feeling. So imagine if you're in a conversation with someone and they have, they keep looking the other way. They have one foot pointing towards the door. Observing the body language. Observing, having the self-awareness. Am I rambling? Am I talking too much? Nonverbal cues are majority of communication, as you're aware of.
So I have a theory on that too, is that I wish the schooling system were a little bit, decades and decades behind in education, and our youth are teaching us that. But 93% of communication is tone and body language.
Right.
And in reality, and that's what we deal with. We deal with humans. In reality, we learn nothing about tone and body language. What are we learning about? Words that are spoken.
Right.
So I think the intentional work, it's setting an intention, the intentional work on yourself and your surroundings, super important, right?
Right. And if I could just add one other example, I think, I go into organizations and a lot of times you might see one of the employees' foot on the chair or they're having loud personal conversations in the common area. Having the social awareness to understand what the culture is within the organization. Is it acceptable to have 2 ear pods in the ear? Maybe someone wants to come and engage with you. So that's another idea of social awareness.
Then to the fourth prong is relationship management.
Yeah, to keep it really practical, I would say listening to others. It's your ability to manage your relationships, improve them, right? So listening more, being interested in the other person, being, seeing the other person, hearing them, feeling them, understand what they're going through, not just jumping in to tell them about yourself. So listening, power listening is super important. And then asking for feedback, asking your friends, people that know you very well, your employees, how do they perceive you? Because we're biased to ourselves, right?
That's right. From a macro perspective, again, because you're doing this executive leadership, tying these 4 prongs together, how does it, because you say that emotional intelligence is super important, but what results actually, if you use these 4 prongs and you work on them intentionally, what results have you seen from a practical perspective?
I've seen people in the corporate world, I've seen people get better feedback. We have something in certain corporations called 360 feedback, where you get constructive feedback from all your colleagues. And I've seen that improve over the months. So imagine someone took it today, and then 6 months later, if they're working on their emotional intelligence, the feedback will improve. And people see it all the time. It's pretty obvious and visible.
Yeah, we use 360 feedback, and I love it.
Awesome.
And it's interesting. Sometimes we'll have some employees and their manager above them. Sometimes it'll be completely different perspectives. And then the work to bring them as an observation, to bring them on the same page, that is a great work to actually get them to see things like, their blind spots, if you want to call it that.
Absolutely.
Right? So now that we've defined what emotional intelligence is and went through the 4 pillars, let's just take a specific example. If you're dealing with a leader, and I know this happens often, and their particular issue is imposter syndrome, like in other words, like kind of self-doubt, how would you deal with a client like that?
Yeah, great question. And I do deal with that a lot. Some strategies that I give to my clients is reflect back on all the things you've achieved in the last 10 years, the last 20 years, number 1. Number 2, be aware of your strengths. It's surprising to me that most people that I work with, they cannot rattle off their strengths. Identify your values, your mission, and just have self-awareness of all these things.
I think of it in like the same box of like positive self-talk. The past, the things that I've accomplished, constantly, you have to be your own cheerleader in a way, right?
100%, definitely. We have about 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day, as research suggests, and majority of those thoughts is negative. And then we're also being bombarded with news, media, and everything else, which is not always positive. So we really have to do a good job saying affirmations, saying positive, having the positive self-talk, and identifying, deconstructing any negative stuff and replacing it with the positive.
A good tool that I like to use, and I started this a couple of years ago, is before every text, every email, I start with the word yes, instead of the word no. It's like programming, because we're a computer system, right? Programming your system.
I love that.
I know the hardest part of leadership for me is is having those tough conversations. How do you coach a client through having to do that?
Yeah, and I could see how such a nice guy like yourself would have a hard time with that. I would say start off with visualizing it going well, number one. Having empathy for the person, being open to see if there's a other side, because the other person has their own version of the story too. And being hopeful about it, that it may not go as bad as you think it will. A lot of time, what we bring into the room, people feel it. They feel our energy.
Sure.
And if we've already psyched ourselves out that this is going to go bad, we might be a little nervous or attaching the other negative emotion, and they can pick up on that, and then they're going to reflect that. So I think one way is visualizing and going well, do some nice breathing exercises, being empathetic, listening to them is a very powerful tool.
I love that. So tell some of your clients that you currently and formerly worked with.
Yeah, well, I'm down here in Miami Beach. I was working with the state of Victoria. They're part of the Australian government, and I was doing a one-day retreat with them. So I do executive coaching with one of their senior directors. I have clients that work at Google, YouTube, Wells Fargo, different financial institutions, different startups.
That's great. How did you get into this space to begin with?
I've always been interested in personal development. And in my first year of law school, I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I did a lot of self-reflection. And it just kind of brought me to the space of coaching. Coaching turned into I kind of became more of a niche into executive coaching. Because I had a lot of clients come who were mid-level managers or senior managers, and it just became more of my specialty.
So listening to you now and also knowing your story of your childhood, the juxtaposition is tremendous. And I want to tell the audience, maybe you could, I want you to share a little bit about your journey. Let's go back to where you were born and your childhood story to get you to where you are today.
Sure. So I was born in Iran during the Iranian Revolution when the Ayatollahs took over. My father was killed and murdered. We escaped to Mississippi, and I come from Jewish roots. And my mom married a Southern Baptist Christian from Mississippi to help us escape and to transition into America. I was raised as a Southern Baptist, baptized at a young age at 5 years old, and there was a lot of instability. We moved around probably every 6 months to a year. They divorced. My mom divorced this man when I was very young, but there was a lot of physical abuse, which was very normal to me growing up from both parents.
As that trajectory, so this is your framework, your first bunch of years, right? I assume at some point there was a rock bottom, right? Trending towards a rock bottom, and then a decision.
Yeah, I'll sum up what got me to the rock bottom. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of physical abuse. My mom sent me away at 10 or 11 years old to live with another family. We were in California at the time, and she just wasn't emotionally stable and in the right space to raise the kids at the same time in this studio apartment. So she sent me to live with this other family, and I bounced around a lot to different homes. I eventually ended up in military school, where I was jumped by skinheads, attacked. I was eventually jumped into a gang out of survival to protect myself against a lot of the racism that I was experiencing in the South. in 10th grade, my roommate was stabbed, and there was a riot in the military school, and I was asked to leave. So I'm a high school dropout. The last grade I finished was 10th grade in military school. I became homeless for about 6 months on the streets and living with a friend in the back of a truck, taking showers on the beach, and basically couch surfing. I left that area and took a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles, California, with a couple $100s in my pocket. I got a job, eventually saved up enough money to buy a cheap car. And one day, two guys that I was working with asked me if I would drive them somewhere. So I did, and we went to a party. On the way, they stopped somewhere and they robbed a drug dealer. Within about 3 to 6 months during that time, I was 17 years old. I did not report it to the police. I was aware of it, so that was a mistake that I made. They did many other wrong things within a few months of that period.
Sure.
They eventually got caught, and they tied me into everything. I got arrested, and I was taught not to snitch.
Right.
So I kept my mouth shut, and I spent 7 months in Los Angeles County Jail. And I eventually got released to a rehab, like a halfway house called Beit Teshuva, which is an amazing place in L.A. And then I changed my life around. So that was rock bottom for me.
But I want to tell you, again, this is the first 17 years of your life. And everything, and that's why I want to bring it out, it's so important in the show, that everything is pointing for you to fail, to be under a bridge, fail.
Sure.
Everything's terrible. And then going back to the beginning of the show, how you're an executive coach for these tremendous companies like Google, and that everybody has a story. We just don't know it because nobody shares what's going on in people's minds. And I love that you have the comfort to tell people your story. And I guess from that point, once you hit your rock bottom, and I guess every day is probably a lot of self-talk, a lot of self-work, and probably your executive coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me how that plays into your daily routine. In other words, probably coaching other people helps you continue to grow as a person.
Absolutely. And if I could just
Sure.
insert a few other ideas, facts that after high school, I eventually graduated from college, worked in corporate America, worked at the district attorney's office, went to law school, graduated, and then became focusing more on coaching. How does coaching help me? I practice what I preach. I've done a lot of self-work. I've done a lot of seminars from Tony Robbins to Landmark. I've worked with coaches. I've worked with therapists. I've done a lot of different things like psychedelic therapy, which I'm doing now. I'm in the process of doing. And what I do every morning is mindset work. You know, Tony Robbins talks about the idea of your emotions are actually the byproduct of how you're feeling, how you move, your physiology, right? Sure. So getting the right state, making sure your physiology is right is part of the steps. That's one thing I can do. That's one thing I do. And then the internal dialogue. So my story, state, story, strategy, stop doing. What's my story? My story is I'm a victor. I'm not a victim.
I love that. Yeah.
I never looked at myself as a victim, and I'm only sharing my story now to give other people hope that if you've been through some struggles in life, you don't have to give up. You don't have to end up under a bridge or whatever other negative consequences there are. So I didn't ever see myself as a victim. And even in therapy, the therapist said, Joe, it's incredible what you've achieved. I'm like, this is nothing. It's not a big deal. Like, your mom sent you away.
It is a big deal.
You're in jail. Yeah. Thank you. I need to have, I guess, more empathy for myself to understand that. I don't appreciate it as much as I should.
Everything you've seen was unstable.
Right.
That's the thing. You have to remember that. Right. So don't judge self. Don't judge others.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about 40 Pillars.
40 Pillars is I do consulting, training, corporate training, and coaching, helping other people actualize their potential. That's my mission, is to help leaders actualize their potential so they can have a ripple effect and impact other people.
I want to say thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Because I'm sure there are people listening, and through the different shows, it definitely inspires people. But I know for sure I've been inspired to continue what I do. So thank you for that. How can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
40pillars.com and LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Common Denominator podcast. Join us next week for another inspiring, impactful, and empowering conversation. To learn more about Moshe, head to MoshePopack.com. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And we'd be grateful if you could rate, review, and subscribe to the show.